Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to your dyslexic reading of Heidegger by your local Californian on it's like almost 8 a.m., 7:53 a.m. my time. And I'm looking out my window and it's cool. It's like probably just under 50 degrees. There's like a few like hovering low hanging clouds. I can see the sun rise in the background, kind of illuminating the clarity of the air after flash floods and stuff that California's gotten over the last week. And so there's a kind of crispness to the air. There's the sense of it having rained lingers in the clarity. So that's what this guy's that's the weather conditions over here. So Heidegger, I want to I want to just say a couple of things about some things I've been thinking about since the last reading that have kind of really that seem important, and they seem important to this particular text, but it's something that I realized something, a particular word that I never connected with Heidegger, but I think I got a sense of it here. And if we go back to this this paragraph where he talks about or defines or articulates or presences the basic disposition, right, of philosophy. And he's talking about, right, this place right here. The restraint is the basic disposition of the relation to being, with a capital B, or being as such. And in it, the concealment of the essence of being becomes what is most questionworthy. So this is really important, right? Especially this part, the concealment of the essence of being becomes what is most worthy of questioning. So in other words, the restraint of conserving and preserving, right, the co-constituting element of ourselves, right, as being, the way being is for us, right, is constrained and preserved, right, between these tensions of terror and of awe, right? And he's not necessarily meaning like subjective feelings. He's talking about constituting understandings, right, in some sense, of terror and awe, that when you can hold that basic disposition, right, in question and engage in the questions that give rise to philosophy, right, what becomes element is the uncanniness of being, and in that it conceals from us. But that concealment in that basic disposition is what makes concealment become something that we can ask questions of, right? So important. This element of noticing the withdrawing of being, the uncanny withdrawal of being in our very disposition, right? For which it's constituted and it co-constitutes being. It's that eye or that scent or that able to perceive that which is concealed, which is interesting to think about, because usually when we think about understanding, we think about revelation. We think about what's revealed, what's unconcealed, what we can see, thereby then we can ask questions about. But Heidegger is saying, like, no, there's something more radical going on here, that there's the element of concealment as such that one can begin to have access to and begin to bring questions, right? But one must do it not as a spectator standing out, right? Because something like a cogito, right? Rene Descartes' subjectum, right? Can't it's in the domain of revelation of objects you can see, right? It doesn't have access to concealment or the domain of concealment. So what he's saying is that we can't be Cartesian subjects, right, and ask the question of basic philosophy, right, of the essence of philosophy. No, we can't do it as subjects representing objects, right? Instead, we have to do it through our very disposition, right? Our embodied, participatory, perspectival way of being immersed in the as my friend John Vervaeke would say, the agent and arena relation. So that's kind of what we're doing. And now there's also this one word that I've heard Heidegger express, right, in multiple times in multiple ways, where he talks about being, the sway of being holding sway, and he says it here. Being, okay, yeah. So namely that beings are, and awe in the face of what is remotest, namely that in beings and before each being holds sway, right? So he's getting at like, so being holds sway. Now I always heard him talk about that multiple times, and I never really quite connected with that. And I always thought like maybe if I understood German, like that word or whatever that word is German would have more meaning or something like that. But then I started thinking about it after the reading, like holding, like what is a sway, right? And you think about, well, what's something that sways? Well, a boat sways, right? And so if you start thinking about it like a boat, being in a boat and it's swaying, the sway is manifested, right, in the very center, on the periphery, on the whole of that whole boat, right? It's manifested in that sway. Yet the sway is somehow both in the boat and outside of the boat. And you never actually directly experience the sway, is, at least if we say experience is like comes to appearance to your senses. What comes to appearance to your senses is this movement of the objects. You can see the movement, you can see the consequence of the sway. But the sway itself is like constituting and determining everything, right? Yet it itself doesn't appear, but is most constituting within the sway. And so this is analogy to being, right? That being is this thing that kind of gathers, constitutes everything and shows everything, in some sense determines everything, gives it its being, but withdraws in not being one of the beings, in the same way a sway is withdrawn, right? Yet constituting, most constituting, right? So that's another way of getting at the being of beings, I think. And I don't think I ever quite made, like, totally grok that connection. I don't even know if I still grok that connection, but I think I got a little closer to it right there. Okay, so let's go on to this section here where it says, actually, let me share the screen. Okay, so this is, I think, page 4. And the subtitle for this is Philosophy as the Immediately Useless, though Sovereign Knowledge of the Essence of Beings. I'm going to read that again. So right there's something, that's a pretty packed thing he just said. Philosophy as the immediately useless, though sovereign knowledge of the essence of being. So what's going on there? That's, there's this kind of contradiction or paradox, right? Because usually when we think of something that's sovereign, it's like the essence of being the most useful, right? People fight wars for their sovereignty. Like people will stand for their sovereignty. They'll protect their sovereignty. They'll stand by their sovereignty, in their sovereignty, right? It's like this, it's a stand by which you then go and can comport the world, right? And if you lose it, you lose your ability to grasp the world. You lose power to be able to do stuff because you're not sovereign, right? So how could this philosophy be sovereign but yet useless in some sense? Philosophy philosophy as the immediately useless, though sovereign, knowledge of the essence of being, right? So that's, I think, right there is we can say like, okay, so the rest of this on some level is going to start to distinguish this apparent contradiction to this paradox. Or just, you could say he's, in some sense Socratically drawing you in. Okay, first paragraph. Depending on the depth of the history of a people, there will exist or will not exist in the all-determining beginning the poeticizing of the poet and the thinking of the thinker, i.e., philosophy. A historical people without philosophy is like an eagle without the high expanse of the radiant ether, where its flight reaches the purest soaring. Okay. Depending on the depth of the history of a people. So history. So this is the first time he uses this word in this book, and it is the word history. And I have to say, man, that is the most slipper. I do not know what Heidegger fucking means when he says history in the way that he uses it. I mean, it's one of those things where it's whatever it is, it definitely, he doesn't mean it as a representation. Because there's moments where I kind of get it, and then it bucks representation, right? But it's really important, right? And in this, I think this book, if I recall, is really one of the first times where he's distinguishing history in this way. He talks about history being in time, but there's a difference. It's connected, but there's a difference here, and it's a fundamental difference in his later philosophy, in which this book, my understanding, is considered the book where he makes that turn, right, towards history, or with history, or of history, or whatever the hell he means by history. So one of the things I'm looking forward to in reading this is to grapple with this notion and see if we can start to hear what is being said in this word, history. Because he doesn't mean it. In fact, he just like rips, he continually doesn't, he takes many moments, right, to say deeply criticize, right, the normal notion of history, which is, my understanding, is represented as a historical past of linear events that can be accurate, and it's a kind of science, like that whole thing. He's like, right? He kind of scoffs at that somehow, because this history is the thing, right? But man, it's really difficult to understand. In fact, I heard a philosopher, Ivo de Janeiro, even mention like maybe be a good idea if whatever German word that he uses for this kind of history that he's talking about, then maybe it may be a good idea to get all the Heideggerians together and take a vote and choose a different word, right? Because it's so problematic, right, in that word. But I would say, so my experience with Heidegger, though, is whenever something's enigmatic or problematic, if you stick with it, it unconceals something quite profound. There's nothing arbitrary, in other words, usually went with Heidegger. So if we don't quite understand it, perhaps we should not demand that it be immediately intelligible, but still have to listen. So I want to listen to this word history and its enigma with you as we read this together. So, and also there's other parts where Heidegger talks about this uselessness of philosophy, right? The immediately uselessness of it. And I want to play something by, it was a recording of a talk. It's like 4 minutes long, a recording of a talk of Werner Erhard reading another book of Heidegger's, of Heidegger talking to a professor talking to a Japanese philosopher who his professor was Heidegger, where he's addressing this uselessness of philosophy and what he means by this. So I want to go ahead and play that here. Okay, here we go.
I know I've read this to some of you before, and I want to read it again anyhow, both as a review and for those who haven't heard it to hear it for the first time. This is from Martin Heidegger on the Way to Language. It's a conversation between Martin Heidegger and a Japanese philosopher, one of whose professors had been trained by Heidegger. So the Japanese says, "We Japanese do not think it strange if a dialogue leaves undefined what is really intended, or even restores it back to the keeping of the undefinable." Heidegger responds, "That is part, I believe, of every dialogue that has turned out well between thinking beings." What Heidegger means by thinking is very much different than what an anybody self means by thinking. As if of its own accord, Heidegger says, it can take care that that undefinable something not only does not slip away, but displays its gathering force ever more luminously in the course of the dialogue. That's the methodology of the seminar. That's the methodology of transformation. Not a definition, not a description, not a narrative, not a story, not an understanding, not information. But whatever it is that he's speaking about when he says, displays its gathering force ever more luminously in the course of the dialogue. And he doesn't mean display like something to look at, but rather something to be. The Japanese response, "Our dialogues with our teacher probably failed to turn out so well. We younger men challenged him much too directly to satisfy our thirst for handy information. We are a culture that listens for handy information. Something's useless if you can't use it, isn't it?" You see, maybe what empowers people cannot be used by them. Maybe we need a kind of listening that can be present for what is powerful and not useful. Heidegger responds, thirst for knowledge and greed for explanations never lead to a thinking inquiry, transformational inquiry. Curiosity is always the concealed arrogance of a self-consciousness that banks on a self-invented rationality. What does he mean by that? He means that you think that you were born in such a way that anything which is valid, you are going to understand. Therefore, anything you don't understand must be invalid. That's what he means. The will to know does not will to abide before what is worthy of thought. He's saying there exactly what I just said a moment ago, that this will for information, this will for tips, this will for prescriptions, this will for how am I going to use it? How does this apply? How am I going to fix it? How is this going to help me to fix it? Is no will to be with what you're being with. It's different to be with.
So there's nothing like being yelled at first thing in the morning by Werner Erhard about Heidegger. I always really liked that. I always really liked that. I played that a lot in my courses, like with people that were training to circling, especially about when we're trying to get at a deeper sense of listening. What is it to listen, right? And which is, I think, what we're attempting to do, and this text is attempting to do, is to attune to, right? To tune, right? There's a like an auditory sense to that, right? Literally, what is it to deeply listen? Well, what do you think he's saying here, and what he's revealing is that philosophy is the opening up of that domain, which isn't immediately useful or practical, consumable, right? And that if you try to listen to philosophy that way, you're going to look at it as something to use, right? Whether or not it's practical, you kind of overtake it and, give us more power or something like that. And he would say that all of that is the concealment of philosophy, right? Philosophy is this disclosure, right, of what is most somehow obscure but luminous, right? Like somehow most concealed yet constituting of everything, and makes available or speaks to what makes available anything at all, right? And that to get at that domain in this disposition of restraint is precisely, right, in some sense, restraining also our sense of comporting the world in some practical kind of consumerist, representational, idle talk kind of way, right? That it's as well as restraining from that, such that something else can open up, right, and begin to walk with us. And so I thought that really kind of gets at that, right? So it's really a profound kind of listening that has a certain restraint to it, right? In some way, as in this first paragraph where he talks about, to remind us, if we invest, right, philosophy will reveal itself when we question, i.e., if we invest everything without exception in this questioning, do not merely act as if we were questioning while still believing we possess our reputed truths, right? So the possession of our already always reputed truths, right, that we see with, that we don't see, right, that we presuppose in everything, right, is what gets in the way, and what we want to refrain from, withhold ourselves in a disposition of restraint, and stand before something, right, such that it could begin to reveal itself to us at a dimension, right, that is the most obscure in some way, yet is most familiar somehow, right? So this is really important. I hear. Okay. So he goes on. I'm just going to go through this paragraph again. So depending on the depth of the history of a people. So right there, he's saying that a people and a people's depth has something tied to its history, right? And there will exist or will not exist, in the all-determining beginning, the poeticizing of the poet and the thinking of the thinker, i.e. philosophy. Okay, so here's this phrase. This is really kind of an interesting phrase. In the all-determining beginning, right? There will exist or will not exist in the all-determining beginning. So there's this connection. I'm hearing a connection between this history and the all-determining beginning, right? So there's the beginning, right? So there's the start of something that you could say the way it starts, right, is determinate of where you end up in some sense. That's one way of looking at it. So you could say the beginning is what is before everything else. But there's another more generative way of understanding the beginning, which is the beginning, and I think this is what he means, the beginning is what already always arrives first. And in that sense is generative of every moment. So the origin or the beginning is something that is revealed right through the history as that which always already arrives first. So in that sense, it's the most mysterious, right? It's the most compelling, and it's the origin is what is somehow most having something to do with that spring-fed lake, right? That when you're connected to the beginning, right? That beginning isn't back there in a past, but it's something that always arrives first. It's always the beginning in that sense. I think that's what he's getting at here. And he says, a historical people without philosophy is like an eagle without the high expanse of the radiant ether, where its flight reaches its purest soaring. So in other words, he's saying that just like the eagle in the sky are obviously, the sky is, you could say native ground, right, to the eagle. The eagle couldn't be the eagle without the sky, right? It's the sky and the eagle are co-constituting of each other. The sky constitutes the eagle and reveals the sky and reveals the eagle, and the eagle unconceals the sky and back and forth, right? And what I think he's saying is that for a people, for a culture, right? And he's relating this to some kind of historical sense, right? That philosophy and its elucidation is somehow native, right, to a people as an eagle is to the sky. That's kind of what I'm hearing there. Well, let's see. It goes on. Philosophy is completely different from worldview and is fundamentally distinct from all science. Philosophy cannot by itself replace either worldview or science, nor can it ever be appreciated by them. Philosophy cannot at all be measured by anything else but only by its own now shining, now hidden essence. If we attempt to calculate whether philosophy has any immediate use and what that use might be, we will find that philosophy accomplishes nothing. Okay. So let's go back here. So philosophy is completely different from worldview and is fundamentally distinct from all science. Okay, so why is that important? Worldview. What is he meaning by worldview? So, okay, a view, right, comes about through standing and having a perspective and taking a picture. So I think he's referring to like a worldview is something that subjects have, right? And it's the way it's like kind of the gestalt object of a subject is the worldview, right? And it's a picture that kind of can stand out in front of it, and then you can look at it. And so what he's saying is philosophy is completely different from that. We're not taking a picture about the way things are as if it's out there that we can take a snapshot and have a perspective on it. It's not just a perspective, right? And is fundamentally distinct from all science. So I think we're going to have to read on to know what Heidegger is meaning by science and its significance here. Philosophy cannot by itself replace either worldview or science. So he's saying that it's not that like philosophy is somehow better than worldview or science, right? In fact, philosophy can't replace it, right? It's a difference in kind, I think, or it's different enough such that worldviews and science, right, like philosophy can never be it, right? So it's not like we should replace worldview and science with philosophy. He's not saying that, right? Nor can it ever be appreciated by them, right? So in other words, but at the same time, science and the worldview from their perspective, right, from their way of comporting, cannot at all grasp philosophy, right? They'll have a tendency to see it not as an eagle without like an eagle to the sky, right? They won't be able to see it that way. They'll see it in their own terms, right, and make it practical or useful in some way. And I think what he's saying is that if you do that, you're completely missing what philosophy is, right? But it's also to miss what philosophy is, I think is what he's saying here, is what I'm hearing is you're also missing what makes a people what a people is. You're missing something fundamentally like in native soil to a people, to a culture. Philosophy cannot at all be measured by anything else, but only by its own now shining, now hidden essence. And I think this kind of, parallels, right, in that way that we were talking about in the first video, where if philosophy is really practicing philosophy, it itself is always interrogated in a question, right? In other words, as long as there's philosophy will not be settled in the matter, right? It will always be a question to itself. As, by the way, being a human being is the being for which our being is a question for ourselves, right? So there's this very deep, very, very deep link between like the practice of philosophy and the practice of being human. Thus, the native ground of a people. That's what I'm hearing. If we attempt to calculate whether philosophy has any immediate use and what that use might be, we will find that philosophy accomplishes nothing, right? I think that's kind of self-explanatory. And we'll go on here to the next paragraph. It belongs necessary to the character of ordinary opinion and practical thinking always to misjudge philosophy, whether by overestimating or underestimating it. Philosophy is overestimated if one expects its thinking to have an immediate useful effect. Philosophy is understood if one finds in its concepts merely abstract, remote, and watered down representations of things that have already been solidly secured in experience. So in other words, those things that are solidarily secured in experience, right, are things for which the subject can represent, right, and manage and manipulate and have power over in some sense, right? And philosophy precisely opens all that up, right? So if you try to look at philosophy and represent it, right, you're not going to see it. You're going to miss it. You're going to appropriate it and, for some other means and ends that are just going to reconfirm the basis upon which you're already standing from, right? And philosophy by nature is, its domain is to question those very bases and to constantly question them, right? Okay. I think we'll read this last paragraph and then we will call this a day. Yet genuine philosophical knowledge is never the mere addition of the more general representations, limping behind a being already known anyway. Philosophy is rather the reverse, a knowledge that leaps ahead. Okay, so there's this leaping ahead. So here's this, you remember we're talking about a futural philosophy, this sense of the future. So philosophy is rather the reverse, a knowledge that leaps ahead, opening up new domains of questioning and aspects of questioning about the essence of things, an essence that constantly conceals itself anew. So again, here's that part where, right, in the proper disposition of philosophy, right, opens what becomes available, right, to question is this dimension of concealment, what withdrawals, right, what escapes any clear cutting, like any representation, any subjects and objects and resources and all of the average everyday normal way of things being intelligible to us, as at least in modernity, that philosophy, and well, let's just read this again, leaps ahead, opening up new domains of questioning and aspects of questioning about the essence of things, an essence that constantly conceals itself anew. So he's equating the essence of something is that which is continually renewing, is essencing through concealing itself. And that philosophy is abiding to the movement of that concealment, right? And in that sense, philosophy opens new domains such that world can disclose in deeper and richer and fuller and radical ways, right? In other words, it's not a picture that we can take and then talk about and possess, right? It's something else. Okay, where was I here? Essentially conceals itself anew. That is precisely the reason this knowledge can never be made useful. Philosophical reflection has an effect, as if it does, always only mediately, by making available new aspects for all comportment and new principles for all decisions. But philosophy has this power only when it risks what is most proper to it, namely, to posit in a thoughtful way for the existence of man, the goal of all reflection, and to establish thereby in the history of man a hidden sovereignty. Okay, so there's that word again, history, right? And now sovereign, it's within this this history or this sense of history, right? That is a hidden sovereignty. So what he's saying, I think, is what is this concealment within this very concealment that essence by means of, right? That within that very concealment, right, is this hidden sovereignty, this freedom, if you will. I mean, there's way more to it than that, but we can go into it more, I think. Okay, he goes on. We must therefore say philosophy is the immediately useless, though sovereign, knowledge of the essence of things. So I'm going to read that whole paragraph one more time. Yet genuine and philosophical knowledge is never the mere addition of the most general representations, limping behind a being already known anyways. Philosophy is rather the reverse, a knowledge that leaps ahead, opening up new dimensions of questioning and aspects of questioning about the essence of things, an essence that constantly conceals itself anew. That is precisely the reason this knowledge can never be made useful. Philosophical reflection has an effect, if it does, always only mediately, by making available new aspects for all comportment and new principles for all decisions. But philosophy has this power only when it risks what is most proper to it, namely to posit in a thoughtful way for the existence of man, the goal of all reflection, and to establish thereby in the history of man a hidden sovereignty. We must therefore say philosophy is the immediately useless, though sovereign, knowledge of the essence of things. Okay. I think I'm going to call this video complete, and we'll pick this back up in the next one. Thank you.